Welcome to Charting the Course, Navigating the Future of American Naval Power. Today we are privileged to be joined by Brian Clark, a Senior Fellow and Director of the Center of Defense Concepts and Technology at the Hudson Institute. Mr. Clark is a renowned expert in naval operations, electronic warfare, autonomous systems, military competitions, and wargaming. His extensive background includes distinguished service as a former U.S. Navy officer, analyst, and consultant. Brian Clark's contributions to the field of naval warfare and strategy are substantial, demonstrated through his insightful reports and articles, including notable works like Unalone and Unafraid, a plan for integrating uncrewed and other emerging technologies into military forces. In this session, Mr. Clark will share his invaluable perspectives on the current and future challenges and opportunities facing the U.S. Navy in the 21st century. So, Brian, how do you envision the future of naval warfare given the emergence of new weapons systems such as autonomous systems and hypersonic weapons?
I think what we're going to see is this transition to a fleet that is more distributed than the one we have today. So unmanned systems, autonomous systems are going to allow us to decompose some of the functions that we've built into self-contained manned warships today to distribute them into a larger number of smaller vessels. So, for example, the Navy wants to deploy this large unmanned surface vessel that'll be an adjunct magazine. So it's going to carry a vertical launch system magazine, and it can act as an additional set of missile tubes for a ship. So you're essentially decomposing that function from the ship, and now you can have the missile tubes somewhere else from where the ship is that's controlling them. Similarly, medium unmanned surface vessel, they're looking at that as being a sensor platform, as an electronic warfare platform, so you can take some of those functions and you're essentially moving them off the ship onto something else. So that's kind of the first phase, is where you just sort of extend the reach and the capacity of the manned ships with these unmanned systems. And then we're going to see a transition going forward to where the unmanned systems get assigned to do their own jobs. Something like what you see in this new replicator initiative that the Navy is a big part of, which is fielding a lot of unmanned systems that'll operate as a unit. So the unmanned systems will be their own little group. They'll be given tasks that are simple. The unmanned systems can do them. They'll relieve the manned force of having to do those jobs. For example, you might put them into the Taiwan Strait so they can attack Chinese warships that might be coming across during an invasion. In that situation, it's pretty simple. Hit whatever you see coming at you. It's like what you've seen in Ukraine in terms of how they're using unmanned surface vessels. So you're going to see this over time, this sort of transition from today's Navy to a Navy with unmanned ships that are acting as sort of adjuncts or assistants to the manned ships. And then we're going to see this continued transition to where there's whole parts of the fleet that are unmanned and they have their own job to do.
How do these new technologies then affect the rising competition from China, Russia, Iran, and other adversaries?
That's where you get into some of the other technologies. Unmanned systems are something that you see Russia clearly using. China's been experimenting with unmanned systems, not as much as the US. Part of that is China is kind of fighting the home game. So they already have basically all their forces at their disposal. They don't necessarily need unmanned systems to expand their capacity, and they don't need to do these operations far from home where you might need to have something that's expendable, where you're going to put it into a high threat environment, because the environment around China is a threat environment driven entirely by the Chinese. So they don't need to necessarily have expendable platforms. So China just doesn't have the urgency that we do in terms of unmanned systems. Russia obviously is experimenting and using these a lot in Ukraine, and I think we can learn from what Ukraine and Russia have both done there. In the area of hypersonics, though, I think is a really interesting technology area for the Navy. Hypersonic weapons are expensive. They're relatively large still for the most part. And so you really need to use them against an important target. You're not going to have a lot of them. So you can't use them to just do area attacks on airfields and things like that. You want to use them to attack something expensive and valuable. So for China, that's great because they can attack US warships, because you hit one with a hypersonic weapon, it's probably out of action. For the US side, same thing. So we can use those hypersonic weapons to attack Chinese warships. And to the degree China comes out to play, the US Navy can use those hypersonic weapons to do that. Now, Part of the reason the US is behind in the hypersonic competition is because China is a lot more motivated to build hypersonic weapons because we've got good targets for them. For our side, we expect China's Navy to take a knee when it comes to a China-Taiwan invasion. And that's going to mostly be amphibious ships and some escorts, and the rest of the Navy will probably stay in port to avoid getting shot at. So we may not get as many targets for those hypersonic weapons as the Chinese might have. But just the same, obviously hypersonics will be an important technology for the US, especially once we've got them cheap enough that we can have them in volume, and that's happening, we're moving that direction. Those might be good to hit some of those Chinese warships. And the concept that we see the Navy considering is, can I use unmanned systems in the Taiwan Strait to slow down an invasion, disrupt it enough to where my long-range missile attacks from outside the area can have some good targets to shoot at? It'll be sitting ducks. It'll be kind of a turkey shoot, if you will, in the Taiwan Strait if these unmanned systems are successful at slowing down the invasion. And that's where hypersonic weapons could really be valuable for the US because you've got some good juicy targets to shoot at and makes the expense of the weapons worthwhile. Another technology that I think we're going to see a lot more use of in the Navy setting is quantum computing. It seems very sci-fi still, but we're already seeing quantum computers get introduced, used in very some limited applications. But some of the applications that we're looking at in the future are anti-submarine warfare, where you can use them to find submarines more easily. That can help us to neutralize the submarine threat from China. And hopefully China doesn't do the same thing, right? So if China gets quantum sensing technology matured, they might be able to use it to find our submarines. So that'll be an area where competition is going to get pretty intense.
What are the potential risks or vulnerabilities that these technologies may pose?
Unmanned systems, obviously, it's a broad category of things. It's everything from the loitering munitions we see people using in Ukraine, all the way up to MQ-4 Global Hawks or and MQ-9 Reapers. So there's very sophisticated unmanned systems that are pretty expensive that you probably don't want to lose if you can avoid it. And then you've got these purely expendable systems that you throw out there and you might even recover them and rebuild them because they're so cheap and light. The risk of these technologies is, on the one hand, if we end up building them too expensive, and this is a problem the Air Force is having, if you gold plate them too much, then they start to lose some of their value because the whole value in them really is I can buy a lot of them, they're somewhat expendable, and I can use them for missions that I wouldn't use my manned platforms for. And the Air Force, for example, is finding on its collaborative combat aircraft program that some of those vehicles are going to be $30-40 million, in which case they cost as much as a cheap airplane, so a cheap manned airplane. So it's sort of, you can't use it the same way. So the Navy's having to contend with this in its unmanned surface vessels. The medium unmanned surface vessel is going to be tens of millions of dollars, probably. The large unmanned surface vessel will be hundreds of millions of dollars, probably, because of its size and complexity. At a certain point, you kind of have to wonder, what am I getting out of making these unmanned? Why not just make them manned and then able to be optionally unmanned? You can take the people off them and have it be automated if necessary. So the Navy has to kind of focus on the lower end in these unmanned systems, and they are now. They're really putting a lot of attention on smaller unmanned surface vehicles, unmanned undersea vehicles that you can buy in volume. And then the challenge is you got to move them where they need to be because they will not be fast. They won't have a lot of endurance. So you have to position them forward, or that to be carried by something else in kind of a nesting doll sort of approach. And the Navy's pursuing approaches like that too, and looking at motherships that would carry these unmanned systems into theater, or just looking at the manned platforms that would carry them into theater. The other risk, which a lot of people would probably focus on, is the automation, AI. These vehicles are designed to operate without a lot of human intervention. How do you keep people in the loop enough to be able to prevent them from doing something bad, like attacking friendly forces or attacking civilian targets, or just missing the target that they were trying to shoot and not getting their mission done? And so there's a lot of work being done on that. And the challenge there is getting good data. So what happens is we don't do a lot of military fights. So there's not a lot of data on warfighting to be used for these systems. And a lot of them use synthetic data to generate a library to train the AI on. And that can cause you to have a lot of basically drinking your own bathwater. You might make a lot of mistakes and have those reinforced through the learning. So what the Navy and others are working on right now is, how do we get some real world experience through exercises that I could use to generate data? And then how can I generate data, basically in my ongoing day-to-day operations that I can use to train these systems? So that's really where the focus is now, is how do I provide the data that allows these systems to be trained well so they make fewer mistakes when I get into the actual operation.
think about collaboration, cooperation with our allies and partners, especially in the Indo-Pacific, Middle East, Europe. There's a lot of sophistication here, and how does that interact with our allies and partners?
That's a great question. So we're doing some war games with the Japanese and the Australians right now to look at that question of, how do our navies work together? How are these shared? And then how do we integrate them between allies? So for example, we field unmanned systems like the medium unmanned surface vessel is designed to be a sensor and an electronic warfare platform. Do we want it to be controlled by a Japanese or Australian ship or commander? Do we want it to be able to detect and understand that that's a friendly ship over there and, not to interfere with it? Do we want to have these operating in concert with each other because they have their own unmanned surface vessels that they want to deploy? Do we want their autonomy to talk to each other so that an Australian unmanned surface vessel can interact with our own surface vessel and have them do collaborative operations? So those are a lot of the issues that are being kind of worked through now. And I think initially what we're going to see is each ally will largely field, when unmanned systems are deployed with manned platforms, they're probably going to be more like the ones that we share amongst the allies. So for example, Japan is using the MQ-9 Reaper right now, which is the same system the US has. It's the same system that India is getting. So there's a lot of commonality there and interoperability. All these nations have MQ-4s, Global Hawks too. So you could see the Japanese buying like the medium unmanned surface vessel that the US has, and then having interoperability by that way. The unmanned systems like Replicator, where the US is fielding a bunch of unmanned systems in their own little package, that might be unique to the US. That's probably not going to be something that gets shared with the other countries. And each country will have its own little unmanned system units. And those are probably going to be the smaller, less capable unmanned systems that you use for like swarming operations or defensive operations. But we're seeing is each country is thinking about doing that independently and relying a lot on their own domestic manufacturers for it. But then when it comes to these larger seagoing systems that are going to operate with the manned force, those will probably be common amongst at least those three allies and probably more.
What kind of a timeline are you talking about?
In terms of the kind of manned-unmanned teaming where you're going to have unmanned platforms supporting a manned ship, you're starting to see that already. So, the U.S. Navy just did this first deployment of the Unmanned Surface Vessels Division 1. So they did a 5-ship deployment of unmanned surface vessels, 5 unmanned surface vessels deployed across the Western Pacific. I saw them when they were down in Australia in November, but they did the whole transit. Australia, Japan, the Philippines, the South China Sea, went all over and then returned back to Port Hueneme where they're based. So they've already done a deployment there. You've already had many exercises where surface combatants have operated with these unmanned surface vessels. We've done a large number of exercises where submarines operate with unmanned undersea vehicles. Usually those are ones that the submarine is itself launched, but they're starting to do more operations where the submarine works with a UUV that somebody else launched. Those activities are happening now. So if we went to war today, you would already see some of these unmanned platforms supporting their manned counterparts. The thing that we're going to see in the next couple of years, though, is the implementation of these mostly unmanned units through like Replicator and similar initiatives. And that's going to be the new thing. And I think it's going to look a lot more like you see in Ukraine, where the Ukrainian Navy commander just talked about how they're recapitalizing their fleet, mostly unmanned platforms. So the Ukrainian Navy, at least in the near future, is an entirely unmanned force operated from shore mostly to go and attack Russian targets in the Black Sea. You're going to see those kinds of little unmanned forces be employed by the Navy. You'll start to see the first products of that in about 2 years. I think it'll expand pretty dramatically after that.
Could you just briefly touch on, what was the motivation for uncrewed vehicles?
The original idea was uncrewed systems give us capacity in the fleet without incurring the cost of people as much. And then we can put them in places where you wouldn't want to put human operators. It's a harder case to make on the water than it is in the air. The case for like a Reaper or a Predator unmanned system makes a lot of sense, right? They can fly for a long period of time in these environments where it's pretty permissive and it would be kind of a boring, expensive mission to send a manned aircraft to go do those operations. On the water, you kind of have a similar argument to say, well, why, if we're going to do ISR missions or monitoring missions, why don't we use an unmanned system to do that? And that's pretty much happened. So pretty much the Navy and the Coast Guard and NOAA have all transitioned to using unmanned systems for the vast majority of all long endurance ISR and ISR monitoring missions. So we're using glider unmanned vehicles, we're using UUVs, we're using stationary unmanned systems to do a lot of that stuff that used to be something that a human and some kind of ship would have to go do. So it's amazing how quickly we transition to a lot of these kind of dull day-to-day operations have gone unmanned, and it's sort of been happening without people noticing it. The other part, though, is that the Navy was saying, well, we need to come up with ways to expand the capacity of the manned fleet in these warfighting operations. And that's why you really saw the push for unmanned surface vessels like the medium and large unmanned surface vessel, because they can give you this additional missile magazine, or they can give you additional sensor platforms, or they can do jamming on an enemy without having to reveal the presence of a manned platform. And that's really been the big push, is that trying to reduce the risk to the manned parts of the force, especially as the manned parts of the force shrink, because we've had to reduce the number of ships in the Navy because of manpower costs and also the maintenance costs of the manned fleet. So I think going forward, what you're seeing is money is a big driver of all this now. So we've gone from just warfighting, the risk benefit being there, to now saying, well, the benefit of unmanned systems is also they change the cost structure. So even though they take people, they don't take as much people, and people are very expensive. They require maintenance, but the maintenance is not as expensive because these vehicles are less complex than their manned counterparts. So that money argument is now getting a lot more prominence within the services. And then I think what we're going to see as we move into this world where you've got these units that are entirely unmanned, the benefit's going to also be operational challenge you can impose on an enemy. Because if you've got this group of mostly or entirely unmanned systems, there's lots of ways you can mix and match kill chains out of that. There's lots of ways you can organize them and deploy them. So the swarming behavior is one way to call it, but just basically the complexity you present to an enemy makes it really hard for them to plan against, and it can be a useful deterrent. So I think we've gone from that value proposition being, hey, this is nice for these dull missions that nobody wants to do, or maybe in a really dangerous environment like space, to money is now the big driver. And then we're going to be going into this environment where the operational value and the complexity is the reason that we're pursuing the unmanned solution. So it's an evolving, value proposition that's been driving the unmanned revolution in the Navy.
Go ahead.
Sure,
You
Dale.
mentioned the Chinese are ahead in hypersonics because we have the big targets. What are the defenses against them? Is it lasers? Yeah. How do you defend?
Defense against hypersonics has been a big technology area of focus for the U.S. The U.S. has not put as much money into hypersonic defense as it has into hypersonic offense. But on the defensive side, the defense is mostly really high-end surface-to-air missiles and then space-based sensing. So using satellites that are looking down to see the hypersonic missile, because they go so fast, they get really hot. And so you can use an infrared sensor to track them from space and then communicate that down to the ship. And then ships, or whatever the target is, actually can shoot them down relatively easily because if you're at the target, the missile's got to come to you, right? So you can shoot back at it. Whereas if you're trying to shoot it on a crossing shot, it's very hard because the warhead's going so fast. But it's a lot easier to shoot down if you're at the target location. So that's the general approach, is you use space-based sensors and kind of point defenses to take out those hypersonic weapons.
Thank you for that background. And thank you for all that you do for the intelligence community, the Department of Defense, Navy. Thank you for your naval service, and certainly for your time today.
Oh, you're very welcome.